The world of Queen Victoria. Setting the scene. When people think of the Victorian age, they often imagine strict manners, heavy clothing, candlelit drawing rooms, and a world of prim and proper behavior. But what did it really feel like to live under the social rules of the 19th century? To understand the daily lives of men, women, and children, we need to step back and set the stage. The world of Queen Victoria herself. The Age of Victoria. Queen Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901, and during this time, Britain was transformed. At the beginning of her reign, London was a city of smoky factories, muddy streets, and horse-drawn carriages. By the time she died, electricity had arrived, telephones were ringing in middle-class homes, and trains carried people faster than ever before. The British Empire stretched across the globe, touching India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and beyond. But despite this rapid modernization, the Victorian world was not free or easy. It was built on rules about behavior, gender, class, religion, and even how one should walk down the street. To be respectable was everything, and to lose respect was social death. Respectability, the golden word. The most important idea that shaped Victorian society was respectability. It was more than just good manners. It was a whole way of life. A respectable person was moral, clean, hardworking, modest, and disciplined. Respectability was visible in the way you dressed, the way you spoke, and the way you treated others. For example, if a woman was seen walking alone without a chaperone, she might be judged as improper and risk her reputation. If a man gambled too much or got drunk in public, he could ruin his career. To be respectable meant you could be trusted. And in Victorian society, trust was tied to social survival. A society obsessed with class. Another defining feature of the Victorian world was class. Britain was deeply divided into layers: the aristocracy, the old families of dukes, lords, and landed gentry. They had titles, estates, and inherited wealth. Their manners were polished, and their role was to set an example of culture and refinement. The middle class, shopkeepers, lawyers, doctors, bankers, and professionals. They were the rising power of Victorian Britain. They were obsessed with showing they were respectable, often stricter than the aristocrats themselves. The working class, factory workers, servants, miners, and laborers. Their lives were ruled by survival, but even among them there were unspoken codes of respectability. Class decided how you dressed, how you spoke, where you lived, and even what rules you had to follow. For instance, a working-class girl might be judged harshly for wearing too fine a dress, while a middle-class lady might be pitied if her gloves were slightly worn. Industrialization and the rise of rules. One of the biggest forces shaping Victorian social life was industrialization. Millions of people left rural villages to live in crowded industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and London. With so many people living side by side, rules became a way to organize society. In factories, strict discipline kept workers in line. In homes, etiquette manuals taught families how to behave properly. In public, even body language mattered. Slouching or laughing too loudly could mark you as vulgar. The growth of the middle class meant that more people wanted to distinguish themselves as refined, so books and magazines began publishing endless lists of rules: how to address a letter, how to host a dinner party, how to greet someone at church, morality, and religion. Religion played a powerful role in shaping these social codes. The Victorian era was steeped in Christian morality. Sunday was sacred, charity was a duty, and sin was something to be feared. Sermons, school books, and popular literature all reinforce the idea that virtue, modesty, and self-control were the highest qualities a person could have. But this morality was often paired with hypocrisy. Publicly, Victorians preached purity and restraint. Privately, scandals were common. Brothels thrived in London, and secret clubs allowed men to break the very rules they enforced on others. Still, the appearance of morality mattered more than the reality. The pressure of appearances. To live in Victorian Britain meant constantly performing for society. Your neighbors, your friends, even strangers in the street might judge you by your appearance and behavior. This constant pressure could feel suffocating. A single slip, a wrong word, a careless laugh, a dress worn at the wrong hour could lead to whispers, gossip, and ruined reputations. For women, the rules were especially strict. They had to balance modesty and beauty, intelligence and obedience, charm and restraint. Men too felt the burden, needing to appear hardworking, serious, and dignified. The stage is set. So what was it like to live under Victorian social rules? It was like living in a giant theater where everyone had a role, a costume, and a script to follow. Step out of line, and you risked social disgrace. Stay within the rules, and you earned respect, security, and the promise of belonging. The rest of this series will take us deeper into the details. From the rituals of courtship and marriage, to the rules of fashion and dining, to the unspoken codes that divided classes and genders. But before we move forward, it is important to remember, Victorian rules were not just about etiquette. They were about power, survival, and identity in a rapidly changing world, family life, and the sacred home. If the Victorian era could be summed up in one phrase, it would be home, sweet home. For Victorians, the family home was more than just a physical place to live. It was a sacred space, a moral training ground, and the center of social life. To understand what it felt like to live under Victorian social rules, we need to step inside the household and see how it shaped daily existence. The ideal of the Victorian home. The Victorians believed that the home was the foundation of society. A good home was considered proof of respectability, and within its walls the strict social rules of the time were constantly reinforced. Unlike today, where work and leisure often blend, Victorians divided life into two clear worlds: the public world of men, business, politics, law, and industry; the private world of women and family, the household, moral education, and child-rearing. This division was known as the separate spheres ideology. The home was seen as a peaceful refuge from the chaos and corruption of the outside world. The father worked to provide, while the mother ruled the domestic sphere. The role of the father. The father was the undisputed head of the household. He was expected to be a moral guide, a provider, and a symbol of authority. His role was less about daily affection and more about discipline and responsibility. A father's duty was to ensure financial security for his family, to act as a role model of self-control and respectability, to protect the family's reputation in society. Many fathers were emotionally distant. Victorian culture valued seriousness and discipline over tenderness. Children often viewed their fathers with fear or awe rather than warmth. Yet the father's presence carried immense weight. A frown or stern word from him could shape a child's behavior for weeks. The role of the mother. If the father was the head of the family, the mother was the heart. Victorians often described women as angels in the house. Her role was to embody purity, piety, and selflessness. The mother's responsibilities included raising children in moral and religious values, creating a comfortable, clean, and welcoming home, supporting her husband emotionally and socially. A respectable Victorian mother was expected to be endlessly patient and nurturing, yet always modest and obedient. Her success was judged not by personal achievements, but by how well she maintained her family's harmony and reputation. The children's place. Children in the Victorian home were not seen as equals, but as works in progress. The family's duty was to shape them into moral, disciplined adults. Childhood was a time of strict education and heavy expectations. Obedience was considered the greatest virtue in children. Talking back to parents or elders was unthinkable. Discipline often involved corporal punishment, especially from fathers. A cane or belt was not unusual. Education varied by class. Wealthy children had governesses and tutors, while working-class children were often sent to work at an early age. At the same time, Victorians romanticized childhood innocence. Paintings and literature often depicted children as angelic, pure beings. This contradiction, strict discipline on one hand, sentimental idealization on the other, defined the Victorian approach to family life. Servants and the household hierarchy. For middle and upper-class families, the household was not just parents and children. It also included servants who lived under the same roof but occupied a lower social tier. Servants had their own strict rules. They were to be loyal, discreet, and obedient at all times. The presence of servants created a layered household. The drawing rooms for the family and guests, decorated to display refinement. The kitchens and servant quarters, hidden from view, where the real labor of daily life took place. Servants often knew the family's secrets, but were expected to remain invisible. For the mistress of the house, managing servants was considered one of her most important duties, a test of her organizational skills and moral authority. Daily life in a Victorian home. A typical day in a respectable middle-class home followed a predictable rhythm. Morning, the father left for work. The mother supervised servants or household chores. Children began lessons or school. Afternoon, social calls, sewing, reading, or gardening. Servants prepared meals and cleaned. Evening, family gathered for dinner, often the only time the father spent with children. Afterward, conversation, music, or reading aloud filled the parlor. This daily routine reinforced the values of order, discipline, and separation of roles. Everyone had a place and a duty, and stepping outside it risked social judgment. The weight of appearances. One of the most striking things about the Victorian home was how much it was designed to display respectability. Furniture was arranged not just for comfort, but to signal refinement. Even the smallest objects, a polished teapot, lace curtains, or a family Bible on the table, carried moral weight. Guests were constantly judging the state of a home. Dust on the floor, unruly children, or an absent father could lead to whispers of impropriety. For the family, the pressure to appear perfect was relentless. The home as a moral fortress. Victorian families believed that a well-run home was not just a private matter, but a contribution to the strength of the nation. Politicians and preachers often said that Britain's global power rested on the morality of its households. In this sense, every family was like a tiny empire, with the father as ruler, the mother as guardian, and the children as loyal subjects. To fail in one's role was seen as a threat, not just to personal respectability, but to society itself. The hidden strains. Beneath the surface, however, the Victorian home was not always as harmonious as the ideal suggested. Strict gender roles could feel suffocating. Women with ambitions beyond the household often felt trapped. Fathers, burdened by the pressure to provide, sometimes grew cold or harsh. Children, caught between affection and discipline, could suffer in silence. Yet the power of the Victorian ideal was immense. Even those who felt suffocated often tried to conform, fearing social disgrace more than personal unhappiness. Closing thoughts. Living under Victorian social rules. Gender expectations. Men as masters, women as angels. To live in the Victorian age was to live inside a system of gender rules so rigid that they shaped almost every choice, behavior, and relationship. Men and women were expected to inhabit entirely different worlds, described at the time as the doctrine of separate spheres. In this world, men belonged to the public sphere: business, politics, money, authority. Women were confined to the private sphere: the home, children, morality, and virtue. These rules were not just cultural habits, but moral laws, believed to be natural, God-given, and necessary for the survival of society. For Victorians, masculinity and femininity were not flexible identities, but strict roles. To step outside them risked social condemnation. Men as masters. The Victorian man was expected to be the provider, protector, and leader. His duty was to work hard, earn money, and maintain the family's status. To be idle was shameful. To fail in business or lose employment was not just a personal tragedy, but a social disgrace. Traits celebrated in men included strength and authority. A man's word carried weight in the family and in public life. Rationality. Men were seen as logical, intelligent, and capable of leadership. Independence. A man's honor rested on his ability to stand on his own and support others. Moral guardianship. Fathers and husbands were expected to guide their families in Christian virtue. The ideal Victorian man was serious, dignified, and restrained. Public displays of strong emotion were frowned upon. Tears, softness, or too much affection were considered unmanly. This ideal, however, was exhausting. Many men lived under constant pressure to appear strong and successful, even when they struggled privately. Women as angels. If men were masters, women were expected to be angels in the house. This phrase, from a popular poem by Coventry Patmore, summed up the Victorian vision of womanhood: selfless, pure, modest, and endlessly devoted to family. The ideal woman was pious. Religion was central to her identity. She taught moral lessons to her children and supported her husband's spiritual life. Pure. Female sexuality was expected to be almost non-existent. Modesty in dress, speech, and behavior was essential. Submissive. A woman should defer to her husband's authority in all matters. Domestic. Her pride lay in creating a beautiful, orderly home and raising well-mannered children. Education for girls emphasized these qualities. Middle and upper-class girls were trained in sewing, piano, polite conversation, and household management. Ambitions outside the home, in science, politics, or business, were considered inappropriate, even dangerous. Courtship and the marriage market. These gender expectations were especially visible in the rules of courtship and marriage. Men were expected to be initiators. They proposed, provided financial stability, and made decisions. Women were expected to be cautious, modest, and virtuous. A young lady who showed too much interest in romance risked being labeled forward or immoral. Marriage was often less about love and more about fulfilling gender roles. A man sought a wife who would uphold his household and bear children. A woman sought a husband who could provide financial security and respectability. Even the wedding ceremony reinforced these roles. A bride promised to obey her husband, while a groom vowed to cherish and protect his wife. Clothing as a symbol of gender. The strict rules of gender were visible not only in behavior, but also in fashion. Men's fashion emphasized seriousness and authority. Dark suits, stiff collars, and top hats symbolized discipline and respectability. Bright or flamboyant clothing was frowned upon for men. Women's fashion was designed to restrict movement and display modesty. Corsets, crinolines, and long skirts made physical labor nearly impossible, reinforcing the idea that women belonged in the domestic sphere. In this way, even clothing became a daily reminder of gender expectations. Double standards. Victorian gender rules were deeply unequal. While women were judged harshly for even the smallest hint of impropriety, men enjoyed far greater freedom. A woman who was caught in scandal could lose her entire social standing, while a man might recover easily. Men could visit clubs, pubs, or even brothels without facing the same condemnation that women endured for minor infractions like walking unchaperoned. A wife was expected to forgive her husband's lapses, but a husband could legally control his wife's property, money, and even custody of their children. These double standards fueled frustration, especially among women who longed for independence or intellectual freedom. The emotional consequences. To live under these gender rules was emotionally complex. For men, the pressure to be strong and unemotional could lead to loneliness and hidden suffering. Many men sought secret outlets in gambling, drinking, or affairs, precisely because public rules left them little space for vulnerability. For women, the constant demand for modesty and submission could feel suffocating. Ambitious women often felt trapped in domestic roles. Even small acts of rebellion, reading controversial novels, writing poetry, or attending reform meetings, could be considered scandalous. Yet not everyone resisted. Many women found pride and meaning in being wives and mothers, and many men embraced the role of responsible protector. Still, the weight of gender expectations was a defining feature of Victorian life. The seeds of change. By the late Victorian period, cracks began to appear in these rigid roles. Early feminists and suffragettes began questioning the idea that women were suited only for the domestic sphere. Magazines and novels started portraying women with greater independence, while some men embraced gentler, more emotional forms of masculinity. Yet even as society changed, the old rules remained powerful. A proper Victorian man and a proper Victorian woman were still expected to perform their roles according to long-standing tradition. Closing thoughts. Victorian gender rules made life feel like a carefully scripted play. Men were the masters of authority and reason. Women were the angels of purity and domesticity. Every word, gesture, and decision reinforced this structure. Living under these expectations meant constantly balancing identity against duty. For many, the roles offered security and meaning. For others, they felt like a prison. But whether one conformed or resisted, no one in Victorian Britain could escape the influence of gender rules. In the next part, we will explore how these gender expectations shaped one of the most dramatic areas of Victorian life. Codes of courtship and marriage rituals. Courtship and marriage rituals. If Victorian gender roles defined men as masters and women as angels, nowhere did these expectations come together more dramatically than in the rituals of courtship and marriage. To live in this age meant navigating a maze of rules about how love could be expressed, how engagements were formed, and how marriage was to be lived. To modern eyes, These rituals might look stiff or suffocating, but for Victorians, they were sacred. Courtship was not just about romance. It was about respectability, morality, and survival in society. The importance of courtship marriage was considered the ultimate destiny of both men and women. For men, it marked maturity and responsibility. For women, it was their highest calling. To remain unmarried was a failure, and spinsters, unmarried women past a certain age, were often pitied or mocked. Courtship, therefore, was not simply a private matter. It was a public performance, carefully observed by families, neighbors, and society at large. A misstep in courtship could ruin reputations. Chaperones and supervision. One of the strictest rules was that young men and women could rarely be alone together. A chaperone, often the girl's mother, aunt, or older relative, was required at almost every interaction. Walks in the park had to be done with a third person present. Conversations were expected to be polite, restrained, and free of impropriety. A man could not simply visit a young lady at her home. He needed permission and a proper introduction. These rules were designed to protect a woman's reputation, since even the appearance of impropriety could damage her chances of a respectable marriage. The language of signals. Because direct flirting was frowned upon, Victorians developed subtle, coded ways of expressing interest. Small gestures carried deep meaning. Dropping a handkerchief might signal availability. A certain flower given as a gift conveyed secret messages through the language of flowers. Eye contact, posture, and tone of voice were carefully interpreted by both families and suitors. In this way, courtship became almost like a dance, filled with rituals and hidden signals, always watched by society. Love letters and tokens. One acceptable form of private communication was the love letter. These letters were often formal, poetic, and filled with moral declarations. A man might write of his admiration for a lady's character and virtue rather than physical beauty. Exchanging small tokens, a lock of hair, a ribbon, or a carefully chosen book, was also common. These tokens served as proof of affection and commitment while remaining within the bounds of respectability. Engagements, a serious business. When a man decided to propose, it was not only a romantic gesture but a serious legal and social contract. Engagements were often lengthy, sometimes lasting years, and breaking an engagement was considered scandalous. For men, proposing was a public declaration that they were financially able to provide. For women, accepting meant a vow of loyalty and purity until the marriage. Families played a major role. Parents might pressure their children toward advantageous matches, and marriages were often seen as strategies for financial or social improvement. Love mattered, but duty and reputation often mattered more. The wedding ritual. Victorian weddings were full of symbolism. White wedding dresses became fashionable after Queen Victoria herself wore white in 1840. A veil symbolized purity, and the act of being given away by the father emphasized a woman's transfer from her father's authority to her husband's. The vows reinforced gender roles. A bride promised to love, honor, and obey. A groom promised to love, honor, and cherish. After marriage, a woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. Her property, earnings, and even custody of children belonged to him. This legal doctrine, known as coverture, reflected the deep imbalance of power in Victorian marriage. The marriage bed. Victorian attitudes toward sexuality were highly contradictory. Publicly, sex was considered a delicate, almost taboo subject. A respectable woman was expected to be pure and modest, with little or no sexual desire. Privately, however, marriage was assumed to involve sexual relations, primarily for the purpose of producing children. Large families were common, though the use of contraception slowly grew later in the century. For men, there was often more freedom. Many visited prostitutes or maintained secret affairs, while women were expected to remain absolutely faithful. This double standard reflected the wider inequality of gender roles. The pressure of appearances. For Victorians, the success of a marriage was judged not only by personal happiness, but by how it looked to the outside world. A couple was expected to present themselves as harmonious, respectable, and morally upright, even if private tensions existed. A wife was judged by how well she maintained her household and managed servants. A husband was judged by his financial stability and public reputation. Divorce, though possible, carried enormous stigma and was often ruinous for women. As a result, many couples endured unhappy marriages rather than face social disgrace. The romantic ideal. Despite these strict rules, Victorians also cultivated a highly romantic vision of love. Literature and poetry celebrated the idea of soulmates, noble devotion, and passionate sacrifice. Couples exchanged sentimental gifts, read love poetry together, and posed for portraits that emphasized their unity. This tension between restrictive social codes and the dream of true love defined much of Victorian marriage. Closing thoughts. To live under Victorian courtship and marriage rules was to treat love not as a free, spontaneous passion, but as a carefully managed performance of morality. Every stage, from the first glance to the wedding vows, was wrapped in ritual, symbolism, and the weight of social judgment. For many, these rules offered stability and protection. For others, they felt suffocating, reducing love to a negotiation of appearances and duties. Yet in every case, marriage was not simply a private affair. It was a cornerstone of Victorian social order. In the next part, we will step outside the home and into the streets, where another set of strict rules governed how men and women behaved in public life. Manners in public. How to walk, talk, and behave. If the Victorian home was a private stage for respectability, the public world was the grand theater. In the streets, in shops, at church, or at a social gathering, every action was scrutinized. How you walked, how you spoke, even how you carried your umbrella, could signal whether you were a respectable person or not. Victorians believed that manners were a moral duty. They were not simply about politeness, but about showing discipline, modesty, and virtue. In a crowded, rapidly changing society, rules of public behavior kept order and kept reputations safe. The power of appearances. In Victorian society, appearances mattered deeply. To be well-mannered was to show that you belonged to the respectable classes. Poor manners suggested vulgarity, laziness, or immorality. For example, a man who spoke too loudly in public might be judged as crude. A woman who laughed too freely might be seen as immodest. Even children were expected to be seen but not heard in public spaces. This obsession with appearances meant that people were constantly aware of how they looked and behaved when outside the home. Walking and posture. Even walking in public came with rules. Etiquette manuals describe the proper way to move. Men should walk with a confident but modest stride, not rushing or loitering. Hands should remain visible, never in deep pockets. Women were expected to walk gracefully without swinging arms or taking large steps. A lady never ran in public, no matter how urgent the matter. Couples followed conventions. A man walked on the street side to protect a woman from mud splashes while she lightly held his arm. Good posture, upright, controlled, and composed, was considered a mark of refinement. Slouching suggested idleness or weakness of character. Greetings and introductions. The rules of greeting were particularly strict. A gentleman never spoke to a lady without a formal introduction by a mutual acquaintance. To approach a stranger, especially of the opposite sex, was scandalous. Men greeted one another with a tip of the hat and a handshake. Women greeted one another with a curtsy or a slight bow of the head. Between men and women, the woman always acknowledged first. Only then could the man respond. Even small details carried weight. Removing one's hat in church, bowing slightly in the street, or addressing someone with their full title, Mr., Miss, Lady. Conversation rules. Victorian conversation was considered an art form full of invisible boundaries. Topics had to be safe, polite, and never too personal. Safe topics included the weather, art, literature, or music, travel experiences, church sermons, or charitable events. Taboo topics included politics, especially for women, money or personal finances, illness or bodily functions, anything suggestive or sexual. Even humor had limits. Sarcasm, gossip, or vulgar jokes were frowned upon. Wit was appreciated, but only if it was clever, gentle, and respectful. Dress codes and public clothing was another language of manners. To appear in public poorly dressed was to risk shame. Each class had its own standards, and everyone was expected to dress the part. Men wore suits, hats, and gloves, even for short outings. A gentleman never appeared without a hat in public. Women dressed according to time of day. Morning dresses were simple, afternoon dresses more elaborate, and evening gowns the most formal. Gloves and bonnets were essential accessories. Children of respectable families were always neatly dressed. Scruffiness reflected poorly on the parents. Fashion was not just vanity, it was a moral statement. To dress properly was to show self-respect and discipline. Public spaces and etiquette. Victorians treated different public spaces with different sets of rules. On the street, gentlemen offered their arm to ladies, tipped hats to acquaintances, and avoided loitering. Spitting, shouting, or laughing too loudly were considered vulgar. On public transport, men gave up seats for women, elders, or the infirm. Reading newspapers was acceptable, but loud conversation was not. In shops, customers were expected to be polite, never to haggle aggressively, and always to thank the shopkeeper. In church, silence, reverence, and proper dress were absolute. Even children were expected to sit quietly. Children were judged harshly in public spaces. They were to be clean, quiet, and obedient at all times. A misbehaving child reflected badly on the entire family, especially the mother. Many parents used outings as a way to teach manners, practicing how to bow, how to address strangers, or how to behave at table. The fear of scandal. Underlying all these rules was the Victorian fear of scandal. A single breach of public manners could spark gossip that damaged reputations. For women especially, being seen in the wrong company or behaving too freely could ruin marriage prospects. This made public life a constant performance. Every word, step, and gesture had to be calculated. Even when Victorians longed to relax, they often found themselves trapped in the careful choreography of manners. The burden and the benefit. Living under such strict public rules could feel exhausting. Spontaneity was rare. People worried constantly about how they were seen. Yet many Victorians found comfort in these rules. They provided order in a rapidly changing world, a sense of security in crowded cities, and a shared language of respect. Manners were not just about controlling behavior, but about creating a visible sign of belonging. To master the codes of public conduct was to prove oneself respectable. Closing thoughts. In the Victorian world, public life was a stage where respectability was displayed through posture, dress, greetings, and conversation. The rules could be suffocating, but they also offered structure and predictability. To live by these rules was to constantly balance personal desire with social duty. A misplaced word or gesture could cause embarrassment, but proper manners could elevate one's standing and secure a reputation for virtue. In the next part, we will step into one of the most ritualized public settings of all, the Victorian dining table, where meals were less about food and more about the elaborate performance of etiquette. Dining etiquette and the ritual of meals. If there was one daily event where the invisible threads of Victorian social rules became most visible, it was at the dining table. A meal was not merely an act of nourishment, it was a stage, a performance, and a mirror of one's place in society. Every bite, every gesture, every conversation over dinner reflected the rigid codes of etiquette that governed Victorian life. To eat was to participate in an elaborate ritual of respectability. The dining room as a symbol of status. In the Victorian home, the dining room was more than a place to serve food. It was a symbol of middle-class aspiration. For wealthier families, the room was carefully furnished with polished mahogany tables, ornate sideboards, and gleaming silverware. It showcased refinement, order, and prosperity. Even for modest middle-class households, investing in a proper dining space was a statement that one belonged to the respectable classes. Meals were staged with theatrical precision. Dinner parties in particular were meant to impress. A guest entering the room would notice perfectly aligned cutlery, folded napkins, and a glowing chandelier above the table. To sit at such a table was to be part of a ritual performance where every move mattered. The sacred time of dinner was the centerpiece of the Victorian day. In earlier centuries, people ate their main meal at midday, but by the 19th century, the fashionable middle and upper classes shifted dinner to the evening, often as late as 7 or 8 p.m. This new timing allowed for greater ceremony, elaborate menus, and the participation of guests. The shift also reinforced social divisions. Working-class families who could not afford candles or servants often continued eating earlier and more simply. But for those aspiring to higher social standing, a late formal dinner became a badge of refinement. Rules of seating and hierarchy. No seat at the Victorian dining table was chosen casually. Placement reflected hierarchy, gender, and rank. The host sat at one end of the table, with the hostess at the other. The most honored guests sat nearest the hosts, with lesser guests placed further away. Men and women alternated seats, reinforcing gender balance and conversation etiquette. To misplace a guest was to risk offense and social embarrassment. Thus, careful planning of who sat where was as important as the meal itself. The art of serving and being served. In wealthy homes, servants played a vital role. Dishes were not left casually on the table. They were brought by footmen or passed with strict order. Serving oneself too eagerly, eating too fast, or taking too much was seen as vulgar. The middle class, lacking many servants, often adapted the same rituals on a smaller scale. Even without footmen, hosts made a great show of serving others before themselves. The appearance of generosity and self-restraint mattered more than the food. Table manners. The unspoken rules. Victorian dining etiquette was a minefield of rules. Cutlery. Forks were always held in the left hand, knives in the right. To switch hands mid-bite was uncivilized. Napkins. Placed neatly on the lap, never tucked into a collar. Posture, sit upright. Leaning elbows on the table was considered slovenly. Conversation. Never too loud, never too dull. Gentle, witty remarks were preferred. Food etiquette. Soup must be sipped silently. Bread broken by hand, not cut with a knife. And peas carefully managed without chasing them around the plate. Failing to follow these rules could mark someone as unrefined. For the ambitious middle class, mastering these subtle behaviors was a way to climb socially. The flow of the meal Victorian dinners were structured in multiple courses, often extravagant by modern standards. 1. Soup or fish as a starter. 2. Roast meats and game accompanied by vegetables. 3. Sweets and puddings such as custards or fruit tarts. 4. Cheese, nuts, and fruit. 5. Finally, port wine or brandy. Every stage required careful timing and decorum. For instance, it was bad form to refuse a dish outright. One was expected to at least accept a small portion. Drinking rules. Alcohol also carried its own etiquette. To drink too much was shameful, yet refusing entirely might appear rude. Gentle sipping, waiting for the host to signal a toast, and never draining a glass too quickly were expected. Women were usually served lighter drinks, such as sherry or claret, while men enjoyed heavier wines and port. Dining as a tool of respectability. Beyond nourishment, meals reinforced social status. Hosting a dinner party was a way to display wealth, refinement, and adherence to proper values. For a middle-class family, inviting respected neighbors or colleagues demonstrated upward ambition. At the same time, the rules excluded those who did not know them. A working-class guest unversed in fork etiquette or conversation codes might be quietly judged. In this way, dining rituals reinforced class boundaries. Working-class meals, a different reality. While the middle and upper classes dined in ceremony, the working poor often had a starkly different experience. Many families lived in cramped homes with no dining room. Meals were plain, often bread, potatoes, and tea. There was little ceremony, only the struggle of sustenance. Yet even here, respectability mattered. A working-class mother might insist on clean plates or modest table manners as a way of showing dignity, even in poverty. The social drama of meals. Every Victorian meal carried the weight of performance. The dining table was where families taught children discipline, where hosts displayed refinement, and where guests measured one another's worth. It was also a place of subtle power. Men dominated conversation.